Good evening. Today is March 15, 2021, and this is the 43rd episode of New Paradigms. I'm your host, Sargis Sangari. My guest today is again my dear friend on this episode, which is airing on the Eyes of March, Al Johnson. Al is a researcher and also a senior advisory board member of the NEC-SE Center for Strategic Engagement. Al was also the previous director for Ramus Challenge, which continues still to this day to train explosive ordnance, EODs, and special weapon and tactics SWAT teams for police and military from around the world. During our last discussion with Al laid out the most simplest steps which every American can take in order to affect future new paradigms of our political discourse. While many Americans out there have seen the inevitability of the violence and the desolation of the courts failing law enforcement and politicians to investigate and also protect the right to vote, and also increasingly the right to free speech, there is a small but significant voice that is saying not all hope is lost, and that if Americans embrace the new American Proclamation, that violence can be avoided this summer, and also government of the people and for the people can once again be a reality. In today's part 3 of our discussion, I will focus on the steps that will correct some of the shortfalls on social media platforms and also their effects on the future political discourse within our nation. Al, as you know, today is Ides of March, which falls on the 74th day on the Roman calendar, which corresponds with 15 March, of course, which was marked by several religious observances, and notably for the Romans as a deadline for settling all their debts. Now, we know in 44 BC, it became notorious for the date that Julius Caesar was assassinated, which made the Ides of March a turning point in Roman history. I hope that today we could provide a possible turning point in American history, especially when it comes to social media and what Americans can do in order to escape the current issues that they're facing when it comes to social media limiting their expressions.
Well, thank you for having me on. And it's definitely true that, we all, through each generation, we kind of face our own Ides of March. The tensions that were exhibited back in Rome and were described in classical literature, have their echoes throughout history and even today. So, what we're seeing is the tension of the plurality, which would be the Senate, and those that want, a plurality of, control and of government versus a single tyrannical, dictator. And that spilled over, the Ides of March, of course, in violence, with the famous quote, et tu, Brute. But hopefully we can avoid that if we maintain the balance of, the people's, the plurality that is able to interact and to control their own destiny, so to speak, versus kind of a singular totalitarianism. And what we're seeing today and what we're going to talk about today is kind of that totalitarianism or the dictatorship of tech. And as we mentioned, a couple times ago, I nicknamed it FASHTEK because it is a fascist tech that operates, because it wants to have this kind of dictatorial, tyrannical reach over all aspects of Americans' life, and it interacts frequently with the government, and so it acts more like a uniparty. So those tensions that we saw back in the Ides of March still play out today, even though, it may not be senators and togas with knives. It's people on online bulletin boards with words. The dynamics are still there. So actually, it's a pretty good point. Great way to intro there.
Well, let's hope we can save the Republic, because at the end of the day, everybody who was involved in the Ides of March ended up dying anyway. So I hope that we could provide maybe a possible, outcome which some of us will survive. And with that said, I know that you brought some. Go ahead, buddy.
Here's a fun fact for you. Everybody that was in that Roman incident today is dead. So there you go.
Yeah. Well, you know what? That's a reality. And I hope most of our politicians and people who are trying to affect political discourse realize that one day we're all going to leave. It's a matter of our legacy. As it was said, the dead are dead and gone, and their good is buried and interred with their bones. However, what they have done, which is bad, will endure forever. So let's hope that we can at least give some good advice from the Near East side of the house. I know you've done a yeoman's work on these slides and give another means and ways of avoiding violence, which is in the talks. There's a lot of chatter about it sometime in our country in the near future, and I hope that we can avoid that and maybe find a civil way of addressing the issues that we have when it comes to tech itself, which affects all of us, to include us and my show, New Paradigms. So with that said, you got the floor, buddy.
Oh, well, thank you. I guess we'll go ahead and start with the jump right into the slides. And the first thing we're going to talk about again is the FASHTEK. So what we have is what we call a fascist tech. Some people call it big tech, some people call it deep tech, but it really is a fascist tech, because what it seeks to do is it seeks to create a total control or a total influence in all aspects of society, from banking, transportation, what and where you eat, your medical decisions, what you can see, how you talk. And frequently they have synthesized to various degrees with the government at local and national levels, and frequently international levels. And so what we're seeing really is this kind of ability to control all aspects of life that Mussolini would have only dreamed about, because the limits of technology did not allow that kind of reach into people's lives that it does today. And so we're faced with a danger that, even though the dynamics are similar to what's happened in the past, the ability of technology to enhance those dynamics creates a lot more control than ever was in the past. And so, how that is going to play out is something we need to take a good look at. And recently we've seen it where it is the control of the people co-ops democracy in the classical sense. So a republic or democracy needs all people being able to freely express ideas, to debate openly the issues, and then choose representatives to reflect those issues, debate, and put those into law that then affects the people. And what we have seen, and actually was self-admitted, was a co-opting of this process, a short-circuiting of democracy, in that there was a few that were able to game the system, if you will, to be able to get an outcome that they desired, not necessarily that the majority of people desired, or at least transparently that we understand that a majority of people were able to go into. So next slide. And so we can see it in a number of ways. In fact, I'm pretty sure that you've experienced at least some of these in your own internet presence with your own companies and your own groups. That people have been silenced in various means, from shadow banning to deplatforming, to various means of taking things off, from everything from hate speech to copyright violation to violation of community service. You can put a video out there, but no one will ever see it because it's been, shadow banned in effect. You can have things, where people are, banned from certain platforms, banned from banking, and that sort of thing. Frequently we see the model of this actually came from communist China, where big tech would have to conform to the communist Chinese model of social control, their fascist model of social control, utilizing technology. And then that echoed back over to America, unfortunately, and then that was implemented here. If everybody's familiar with the social credit score in China, it was kind of a punchline of some late night jokes, and it was kind of like, well, that can't happen here. And yet over the last few months, we have seen that in effect happen here, where based on social media interactions, some people have been banned from banking, some people have been banned from being able to get a lift on Uber or Lyft, that sort of thing. So it's important to understand where this comes from. And then the other part, of course, is the self-admission that most of the moving force or the driving force in the recent elections was actually promoted by a small group of business CEOs and certain activists. So they say it's fortifying democracy, but really isn't, and we don't really have transparency on it. So it's difficult to argue one way or the other. But the evidence, based on the response afterwards, seems to suggest that yes, that has happened. Now, what does this mean? All of these are private companies, so you'll frequently hear the refrain that, well, it's a private company, they can do what they want. But if those private companies are as involved with the government as it is and are able to set policy, they become the public square, so to speak. So it's no longer a private company if it functions to such a scale and a degree that it effectively acts as a utility or a public utility or a public forum, a public square, right? So the Romans, they would go to the public square in the forum and you could debate these ideas openly. Everybody had access to it. You could all go there and stand on your soapbox and, debate these ideas. Well, the government in our Constitution has restrictions on what they can and cannot do. We would call it tyranny if the government came in and said you can't say this and you can't do this and you can't meet here. However, because of the nature of tech, everybody is on that forum, and that has become the primary means of being able to discuss issues in the national and local, even local area. If that's restricted, and it frequently serves the interest of one party or one group within the government, effectively what you've done is you've outsourced tyranny, especially if you can see certain quid pro quo occurring between the businesses and the government. And so basically what we like to say is that they have outsourced the tyranny. So it's not the government doing it, I'm not doing it, but they've outsourced to basically a subcontractor, if you will, to be able to do their dirty work, to be able to quiet the voices. And so that's something that I think we talked about last time, and it's very difficult. I know you've experienced it too. I think even with this show, you have had some issues about certain topics were suppressed and certain censorship occurred. Is that correct?
No, definitely. We had it. As you know, we used to have an opening for new paradigms. We had to actually purchase the music, and it's very expensive to purchase the music and the lines. And we were getting, for the major shows that we had, where you would see a quick uptick in how many people are viewing it, where it would hit somewhere around 50, 60, suddenly jump into the hundreds. What they would do suddenly, they would shadow ban us, and they would use the excuse that Sony Music Entertainment is saying that this particular podcast has to be shadow banned because of use of music when it comes to licensing. Well, guess what? We had, and we still do have, the purchase documents for that particular piece of music. We have shared it multiple times with Facebook. And during the podcast at the end, they would shadow ban us. We would send the information in. They would sit on it for a week. And then a week after the information has become old, as you know, suddenly they would release it again. But by then, nobody wants to watch something that was a week ago. And unfortunately, when we tested it one time, we didn't even put the music in. They still shadow banned us, I guess, under the presumption that we may have thought about using the music that we never used. So it was just ridiculous what we have to go through. And as you see now, my entire platform has changed, where I just showed a picture, new paradigms with Sargis Sangari, not even play the music that we own, that we have paid money for, and significant amount of money to be able to be used on our platforms. It is just, these are the problems that you run into. And other pieces we had where we've taken videos from last week, as I did a interview with Richard Goldberg, who served at the National Security Council and was very key component piece of actually the lead of getting the Iranian sanctions when it comes to pressuring Iran under the previous administration. And you'll see a video that we posted of him on one platform. Your note are 6,000 views within a span of 12 to 24 hours. On other platforms, you get 2-3 views. But when you Google search it, the video that has 2-3 views is coming up. And so people look at it, so it must not be an interesting video. There's only a couple of people who watched it. So a significant portion of the information that I could have watched is missed. The one that has 6,000 plus views, and I think we might be actually north of 15,000 easily now. And these are not just views where you click on and see it. You have to view the entire video. So that means there's 15,000 set of eyes, at least at the minimum, have seen it. That's not even being seen when you Google search that particular video. Sometimes I even have problems when I go on YouTube, try to find my own new paradigms right after the show is done, depending on which one it is. The search engine doesn't even show it in my own channel and directory. So those are some of the issues that we had to deal with, and I'm sure you have plenty of other pieces you could talk about based on the examples we have.
That's exactly right. And so, what you've experienced at your level has been, to the effect that it suppresses your ability to communicate freely. And for example, when you were running in your campaign, all of that added up, which meant you had to expend extra resources, extra time, extra finances to get at least parity, if even that, of what, say, the other personnel you're running against get for free, right? So if for example, you're experiencing all these difficulties, but the other candidate is not, does that represent a bias by the company in suppressing, your message to get out? And so these are issues that we'll talk about, and other people have noticed, because it is so widespread. It's definitely not an anomaly. And this has been going on for quite some time. I've been doing a little bit of research in this one, and we found that during the early 90s is when the internet initially was, this free forum that everyone could discuss information and that sort of thing. But early in the 1990s, I think some people will remember it. It was the Monica Lewinsky scandal. And the traditional media at the time, which was CBS, ABC, and NBC, and then you had a cable network, CNN, and occasionally C-SPAN. These networks were sitting on the story. Nobody was going to publish the story. The editors pretty much just tanked the Monica Lewinsky story. And a little-known aggregator called Matt Drudge Report, put it out there. And it was all in the chat rooms, and then that started breaking the story. And so the traditional hold over the media had been broken, and the internet was so decentralized at the time. And so a lot of people, to include Hillary Clinton, actually looked at the mechanisms by which that this could be corralled and managed. And so they looked at it, and they would use various, keywords and strategies to try to say, why it's important. But the end result of the whole thing was that the cause was to restrict free and open expression of ideas and debates, and to channel it into a few, quote unquote experts or expert channels. And again, we get back to, this is why it is a fascist label, because fascism doesn't like democracy. It doesn't like republic. It likes a few experts that run things and, by government decree, so to speak, or by science, quote unquote. All right. So next slide. So what's been happening over this is we've had some interesting developments since we talked last on this issue. And the first thing is that down in Florida, there's a couple interesting things happening in Florida and Texas. So something about, exposure to sunshine and I guess not getting locked down. They have they have things to do, so they're making legislation, or at least introducing it. And this one's been getting the most press. And this is Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida, and he's introduced what he's, it doesn't have an official title yet, but it's popularly being called transparency and technology. And what it proposes to do is check the growing power and influence of big tech and to safeguard the privacy and security of consumer data. But it's being billed as a way to bring back big tech to heel, to bring FASHTEK to control and that sort of thing. But really, you kind of look at it, it's more of a consumer protection oriented, and it's building off of something from before, which is the Florida Information Protection Act. So basically what it does is it would require some of the larger social media companies who make money in part from selling your data, right? That's how they make their money. It would require them to let you know what data they're collecting on you, and then to tell you what they're doing with that data, and then to give you an option to be able to opt out of that data. Some companies already do this to some degree, but usually the larger ones, it's in such fine print, and then it changes, sometimes from day to day what they're actually doing with that data and what they collect, that it's difficult. Facebook especially was embarrassed recently because it was found that even when you're not on Facebook anymore, they're collecting data on all of the websites that you tend to visit. And then that is being sold to, all sorts of different groups, to include, some of these companies have been giving, your data, your personal data to, some adversarial enemies such as China and Russia. So what this would do would primarily be a more of a consumer protection, in that it would require them to do that. And then it has a $100,000 fine per event per day. And it's more focused kind of an anti-monopoly is how the Attorney General would kind of go after it. However, next slide, it's got some issues. It's got lots of issues. And it was interesting because this one was kind of being promoted. So all the talk shows and so the new, the corporate disinformation outlets were promoting it, which in itself is interesting because if it really had teeth, it's doubtful that these corporations, which also, are owned a lot by, the social media corporations own a lot of the big tech that this is talking about, the FASHTEK this is talking about, but they were promoting it. And so that lets me know, okay, this looks to be more of what we call a puffball or a softball legislation. There's no teeth in it. It's really not going to do anything. It's just feel good, which is surprising from Governor DeSantis, because he's been outspoken on a lot of things and tends to be, from what we've seen, tends to be very strong in his views. However, this really isn't going to do much. And let's look at some of these issues real quick so that your audience can get educated on it. Next slide.
Well, Al, if I may jump in here, DeSantis is also right now looking at possibly running for POTUS in 2024, and he's one of the front runners. So there's not an issue that is Democratic or Republican. If they all get it wrong, we're pretty much holes across the board as we move forward. So, and this is very important because these people are going to be the decision makers when it comes to FASHTEK as we move forward.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, if it works in Florida, if he starts running, then it becomes on the national platform. And then there's some other states, I think South Dakota and a couple others were looking at the Florida model to implement in their own state to be able to do it. So you're absolutely right. It's not just a local issue. As DeSantis, tries to move to 2024, he could take it with him into the White House as a national platform. In addition to the other states that are kind of looking at joining or using the Florida model and pass it in their own state, which is why Florida needs to get it right before it implements it at the state level, because it has such a big impact. It's not just Florida; it's the rest of the nation. It can serve as a model. So if it's a puffball piece, a softball piece in Florida, it's not going to do any good. It's just placebo, and people feel good about it, but things go on as normal, and again, the temperature begins to rise, and the potential for violence increases. So you're absolutely right. So some of the issues in here are probably the one that everybody noticed there. It's only $100,000 per day. And these companies make trillions of dollars. I mean, literally, it's like, okay, I'm going to fine you a penny if you curse, right? That's not a deterrent. There is no incentive for a company to do that. In fact, it's a deal, right? Oh my goodness, it only costs me $100,000 a day to pretty much do what I want. Okay, great. That's a pizza budget for them for like an hour, for one satellite office. So the fines are way too low. In some of the companies we looked at, like the Twitter, the Facebook, Google, and Amazon, that's less than a percentage point of their daily profits. Even if there's 100 people, 200 people that make a claim against them, and it's $100,000 a day, it's still a drop in the bucket. 100 million may be a deterrent. At that point, it might be somewhat of a deterrent for it. But $100,000, definitely not for any of these companies that we're talking about. There's also a loophole. So it does not do what the media or this corporate disinformation outlets are promoting it as, is reining in, FASHTEK, reining in big tech. It's, that sort of thing. It doesn't do anything of the sort. It still allows the FASHTEK companies to censor free speech, right? It only asks that they maintain consistent standards. That's it. So in other words, whatever they're banning now, they can continue to ban it because they found ways in community guidelines and services to ban. So it'll still be a majority of restrictions of free speech, be it the right or the left. It doesn't matter. Free speech is free speech. The ability to debate ideas is still the ability to debate ideas. I don't care what side of the political spectrum you're on, it's still there. So by the language of the bill saying consistent standards, you're not bringing back the free speech. The cyber community forum is still restricted. There's no retroactive protection, so it talks about disallowing candidates from being banned. Specifically, that's what it kind of goes into, is candidates in that language cannot be deplatformed, but it has nothing retroactive. So anybody that's been kicked off prior to this, if they start running as a candidate, they're still banned. Right, so the 500,000 people, or whatever the number was, depending on what you read, that have been banned. If they decide to run for political office, they're still banned. So that needs to change. Right. Exactly. So that needs to change. You're looking at the other thing is it just talked about some of the big guys. Like most people talk about Facebook and Twitter, but the banning of people and the shadow banning and the type of harassment that FASHTEK does extends across multiple platforms that people don't even realize. For example, Andrew Torba talks about it on his Gab, that he's been denied 5 banks. I mean, here's another social media company that it bills itself as a free speech company. But he has about, I want to say 20 to 30 million subscribers. So he's a large business concern, and he has 5 banks that have banned him from using that. We saw people that were, being banned from transactions. PayPal is notorious. In fact, I think I was working we were working something with State Department. I was getting money from one group, and it was in PayPal. And once they made a decision, you're out of PayPal, and there's no appeal. There's nothing, nothing going on. And so you can be banned from banking. And people say, well, you can just go to another bank. I mean, this guy Andrew Torber's gone to 5 banks, and PayPal. I mean, eBay and a lot of platforms are specific to PayPal. And if you can't use it, you're restricted. So it really is creating a multi classes of people, the people that are able to access this and not. And it's equal access that we're concerned about. Communication, commerce, you name it.
Al, I have to say on the record, the PayPal piece is probably Colonel Sangari walked you into a Chinese briefing in Japan in 2015, which probably didn't lead to a positive for you. Don't brief against the Chinese if you want to say in PayPal. So trust
exactly.
me, I've had issues with PayPal even to today. We kind of have to laugh about it. Yeah, but the problem is, as you see, even this new paradigm show, I started it because of the fact that under COVID restrictions, we can go out and see anybody. So I was running against the minority whip at that time, or the whip for the Democratic Party. And here I am running against an incumbent there, who's been in for 20 plus years. I had to find a way to get the name and face recognition out there, and we started New Paradigm. And even in that process, I brought other individuals, I interviewed them, and we brought an independent candidate that was interviewed. Even his show was banned. Now I was a Republican, and I brought an independent in and interviewed him on my show, and we still had issues with trying to get our message out. Yes, it's difficult, and if most people have watched our shows and go back and look at everything else we've done, we've been pretty fair across the board. I don't think we have done anything except for lay out the facts, for people to kind of digest and go through the process as Near East does, to teach actual Americans how link analysis process works. That we always have used, you and me, in both the Department of Defense, and you have used it in the past with the State Department. So it is what it is. So I will take the full-on responsibility on the PayPal issue for Al Johnson not being able to use it.
No, I wasn't going to point any fingers, but well, there it is.
Oh, that's okay. There you go. I point the finger myself.
There we go. We'll just call it an experimentation. We were testing the system, and there we go. So we now have some hard data. So that's exactly.
The Chinese Communist Party was not happy.
They were not. They definitely were not.
Briefed against them in Japan. Yes.
And that you bring up a good point. No, you bring up a really good point, because a lot of people are kind of laser focused on this and support or opposition based upon domestic politics, right? So if you viscerally hate one side or the other, you're going to support this one side or the other. But the real issue is that once the mechanism is connected strategically to the Chinese Communist Party in many ways. For example, Google would not do certain projects with the U.S. Department of Defense, but they would with the Chinese military. So you get these tech companies where they're going to look at their profits and where they see the potential profits go in the future, and they will align their policies, their censorship policies, increasingly on foreign governments, which are antithetical to the U.S. and the U.S. values. So we're not talking just domestic, we're talking foreign. So the people today that are cheering this and saying, "Oh, this is great. We're striking a blow against disinformation, so-called disinformation. We're striking a blow against this stuff." Realize that tomorrow you will be the target, even though right now your political party, say, is in. The Chinese can flip that in a heartbeat, and everything that you hold dear will suddenly go away. So they have to understand that this can backfire in a major way. This is global. This isn't just local. Right now, the drama is, of course, nationally, but it really is an international issue, and we have to be very, very cognizant of that. We've had, even what was the story about 5 years ago? The Hilton guy that liked a tweet that said, hey, support freedom in Tibet. And then the Chinese pressured him to get fired from Hilton. I believe it was Hilton or Hyatt Hotels. I have to go back and look. But it was a major hotel chain, and they received pressure to fire him, and I believe he was fired simply for liking a tweet. And you move that across the board, and very quickly you have lost all pretense at any type of classical liberalism or any type of freedom that there is. And that's the frightening part. And that's why this has to be addressed now and early, before it goes outside of our purview and America is completely controlled by basically Chinese social credit score. So there we go.
Look,
so absolutely right.
And And I'll add one thing to this discussion, as you were mentioning. When 2015 we were in Japan briefing them during that anti-terrorism conference, I did also brief the Ministry of Interior for Japan and their PSIA, which is the equivalent level of the Central Intelligence Agency for us, or the MI6 for the Brits. And in that process, there was a proposal that we made from the Near East Center to them as to how they could counter China trying to get into modernize its military. Unfortunately, here comes Google, not even caring about how it affects our allies in the region, taking steps in support of the Chinese military that actually is counter to what we're trying to do to be able to help our allies, in this case, Japan, in the region. So they did a lot of damage, knowingly or unknowingly, I would say most of the time, to American foreign policy in the long run, because they were trying to make a buck rather than thinking about the strategic outcome of what would happen when China decides to modernize its military capability without being reliant on our allies. So these are the issues that you kind of deal with. These companies are multi-billion, trillion-dollar companies that they could care less. I don't think anybody picks up the phone from Google and calls the regional security officer in Japan or anywhere else, say, hey, before I walk into this meeting and open my mouth and probably destroy everything that has been worked behind the scenes and the behind backdoor rooms and basically destroy all the end user agreements that the State Department has worked for years to be able to put together for regional stabilities of areas. They just go in and do whatever they want to do, and are not beholden to even the U.S. government in this case. And they do a lot of damage across the board for that big buck.
Mm-hmm. You're absolutely right. It's, as I always say, organizational structure dictates outcome, and these companies are typically organized now as nation states. They may have alliances and work, to some degree with the U.S., but if they don't pay their taxes, they don't have any, legal oversight to them, then they are functioning at this level, this level of scale, they're functioning as governments, and it's detrimental to the U.S. government. So you're absolutely right. You can see scenarios. In fact, I'm suspecting of some things, like when you travel to certain countries, you see things on the Google. So any OSINT or open source information intelligence that you want to do, fact finding is part of that other government. Google or whoever can manipulate that data so that the country only sees what it wants it to see, and it can shape its domestic and foreign policy antithetical to the U.S. goals. And so that's important that that the U.S. takes a hold of that just for this reason. You need to bring the FASHTEK to heel. Otherwise, you're looking at new global order in which companies are now governments, and they run things. And so that's, are we as a people, do we want that collectively or not? Or do we even get a vote in it? You see? So again, these questions need to be answered, need to be addressed. And so far, at least with this DeSantis bill, it doesn't do it. It doesn't give the tools to be able to take back some control to get back to a democratic republic. So you're absolutely right.
And one more thing to add on to that, just like even look at it from the Department of Defense perspective, within your joint, within your J sections, I should say within your battalions, you could look at within your companies that the military has for military force structures. Even there, a lot of the civil military operation work that is done even downrange is usually done on the unclassified side, because that's how you have to operate with your local country folks. And the problem is when you have Google dictating even some data information that might be out there that you need to use for your working groups in order to be able to drive the targeting process when it comes to your monthly targeting at a battalion level, or when you have your targeting process when it comes to civil multi operations that feeds into the entire information operations that is driven by that particular unit in support of U.S. Mission and what the Department of Defense has and what our national security strategy is. It does really give bad information sometimes and false information. And governments like China know this. They understand how they could affect even our civil military operations by ensuring that their partners that they have with these particular companies are putting certain type of data out there that is actually presenting a different picture, especially when it comes to Southeast Asia, when it comes to civil military operations. So our guys who are on the ground trying to be that force multiplier are hindered because of what they're not allowed to bring to the table when it comes to using the unclassified form of communication and being able to use this type of data that is unclassified, that is out there on the net, to be used to drive some briefings. And some of those you've even seen have leaked into the classified side of the house, where you actually have a person who's briefing, although it's recognized as being classified, is actually nothing more than open source information that is being driven by what Google is mandating because of the pressure that is Chinese conglomerates that he needs to work with are making on it. So it's a definite larger fight for U.S. interests, especially if we're going to be countering China in the long run.
Yep, you nailed it. The dirty little secret of intelligence is that most of it is OSINT, and that which is easy to do gets done the most often. And the easiest to do is not to go into a SCIF and get on your SIPRNet. It's to get everything off your NIPRNet, because it's quick, it's fast, and you can do it from, you don't have to go into a SCIF and sign in and surrender your cell phone and all that. So most analysts will get a majority of their info for briefings straight off of OSINT, off of what we call the NIPRNet, right, which is the open internet, rather than the secret internet or a closed system. And unfortunately, that floods the system, and that is susceptible to outside manipulation, just as you said. And that is the dirty little secret that most of the briefings that tend to get classified, like, hey, this is some whiz bang, oh, this is real interesting, and I'm like, yeah, this is straight off of Google. And, you look at the footnotes, and you kind of do deep dives on the information of where they got it from. A lot of it was just, they Googled it. They won't say it, but they Googled it. And so, we have to be cautious of that. That's a couple things. That's a couple different, problems to fix. One is institutionally, getting back to, hey, making it easier to get in the SCIFs. Folks can do their jobs and making the SIPRNet a little easier. But, that's one thing. But the other thing is, okay, for the guys that are going to do NIPRNet, because it's easier to sit there and, look up 20 websites on NIPRNet for a report you got for the general, in 2 hours than it is to go to the SCIF. Where they look and what information they see needs to be, free as much as possible from that manipulation from these FASHTEK companies that may be moving more to our foreign interest. So you've absolutely nailed it. In fact, that's probably another discussion for if you got some, some good guys there that can talk about it. That's another great discussion that needs to be talked about.
Thank you, Al. I think you're the guy. So let's go.
No, no. All right.
Go ahead.
Let me move forward before I volunteer myself for anything else. So let's continue on, shall we? So, going back to the slides, the final part that the DeSantis bill doesn't have is it needs a fast track resolution. Freedom Watch way back in 2018. And you'll see this on the news. Some people say, well, it started because of January 6th. It started because of something that happened recently. That's not true. As far back as 2018, Freedom Watch took up an antitrust lawsuit against a number of companies that had banned their client, and so this has been going on for a while. Now that lawsuit is all the way at the Supreme Court now. It has been rescheduled, I believe, 4 times. So since 2018, they just keep kicking this can down the road. So any legislation that goes through needs to have a means to be able to do the enforcement and not get tied up in the courts for years and years and years and years. Where kicking the can down the road, I can just run the clock out, and I don't have any problem with it. The issue's already done. I've already made the impact. So DeSantis's bill has none of this in there, and it really needs to do that. So if anybody that's in Florida, anybody that's working in that area, pay attention to this. Call up your congressman, call up your senators, and say, hey, your state senators, your state Congress representatives, and say, look, we need some teeth in this thing. This thing needs to be a real bill and not a powder puff piece. All right, going on to this one. This is a good one here. So. The Governor DeSantis had put his bill out recently, and it makes me wonder because it doesn't have a lot of teeth. Was he responding to a couple of other earlier initiatives? And one of those earlier initiatives was the Stop Social Media Censorship Act. And this one actually has some teeth into it. And this was done again by another Florida rep. Like I said, there's sunshine, and they're not they're not under lockdown, so they're working. I think Anthony Sabatini put this out in December of 2020. And this one is actually pretty good. So, just going over a couple of the points, it's specifically, it's not just about your data. it goes into guaranteeing the residents' right to the free exercise of speech. And he identifies it also as public forums. These are semi-public forums that are used for political speech. And he also identifies religious speech, which is something we haven't talked about, but it's definitely part of it. And then he sets a threshold, right? So he says this is social media firms, more than 75 million subscribers, and are not, since they've been created, have not been specifically affiliated with any one religion or political party. So it allows you to set up a private group, private social media that is, for example, Catholics Against Abortion social media group, and that is specific for that group. It would not apply to that. It's because that acts more as a private entity versus a public forum. So it's pretty good. And then it also protection liability for such companies who act as censors. So right now, as everyone knows, because of the row that was over Article 230, is that the protection, the government is actually protecting big tech, FASHTEK. So they are protecting them from prosecution, right? They're protecting them from getting sued for what they're publishing. And initially this was to grow the industry. But the effect now is that they're actually editing. They're acting as editors, they're acting as publishers. And so the content now is theirs and they should be held accountable. So Sabatini's law would in effect kind of reverse 230. So that's a good thing. And then users, so, guys like who people have been deplatformed or shadow banned can sue a tech firm if it deletes or censors the user's religious speech or political speech. So it's very specific about it. So we're not talking, hey, somebody says, hey, I'm going to go set fire to something, and they ban him for it. Somebody's inciting violence, actually inciting violence, and they ban him for it. No, it's political or religious speech, right? And this is key here, and a lot of people forget this next part. If it uses an algorithm to disfavor or censor the user's religious speech or political speech, sometimes they've set the algorithms up, whereas if there's certain keywords in it, or if you have a history of liking things off the platform, right? It knows your clicks, it knows your likes, it knows who you are politically or religiously. It can actually use an algorithm, so it's hands off, but it lets the AI say, well, I'm only going to let you have 100 views. You're in your own echo chamber and I'm not going to promote you out, right? And so he actually addresses that, which is very important. We saw at the last couple of U.S. congressional hearings, there's a lot of guys that need some really good advice about how tech works because they were lost in the sauce. They didn't know what to ask the CEOs of the tech companies, and they were not addressing the real concerns about how the tech works and how the tech censors people. So putting that algorithm in there is a good thing, and that needs to go in DeSantis's bill as well. All of these really need to be on DeSantis's bill. So companies' claims they were banning alleged hate speech would not be sufficient defense. Now, this has a little bit of a thing, and we'll get into this in a minute. Hate speech has been used since the 90s. This was actually one of Hillary Clinton and her group's tactics for how do you get control of the internet. And you could say hate speech. And so there was a 1993 report that came out saying that, the telecommunications, they called it back then because the internet was still new, but part of telecommunications was the internet. Was promoting hate speech, and so they have to get a hold of it and they have to control it. And so we'll see that there was actually something that occurred back in '93 that was an echo, a forebearer of things to come. But you'll see that a lot, hate speech, and we'll go into this in a second because that's one of the things besides community standards and copyright that's used to ban people or restrict their views. So next slide. Now this one's another one. So again, Florida is just, they're on fire with this thing. So there's a Representative Randy Fine, and he wrote a letter to DeSantis earlier. So he actually wrote this back in January. So we keep dialing the clock back. And he says, which is interesting because it goes into what we talked about. He says, look, if these companies are going to censor government officials, because I believe they had just banned Trump after January 6th. They had deplatformed the president of the United States. And they said, okay, well, since they're doing that, and they were censoring, I believe some other congressmen or senators, I have to go back and look at the number, but people who were bringing up these real concerns, or they were functioning as government personnel, they were getting deplatformed. And so he said, okay, well, great. You're a private company. If you're going to ban or manipulate the reach of a government official, you're not going to get any government money from Florida, right? So within his purview in Florida, he says, we're not going to buy advertising. We're not going to buy, Apple products. We're not going to buy, Android products, that sort of thing. So if a company actively goes against the U.S. government and limiting their ability to use that platform in an official capacity, well, guess what? You're not getting any government dollars from the state, and that's a good one to take on the national platform. Again, it hits them in the pocketbook, so to speak, and it's an important part of it because that's something we did not talk about earlier. We talked about the quid pro quo and some government contracts, but a lot of these, especially for some Google, some AI, they receive a lot of government money. A lot of your tax dollars go in there. So that's kind of a good path to go down to let the government, which is representative of the people, begin to take control back from FASHTEK. All right, next slide. So we mentioned earlier 1993. So that was an interesting year. So that's when the kind of the more radical left groups were looking at how do you control this wild west of information, because they had actually done a 20-year march to try to grab editorial offices and publications and that sort of thing. So they had a fairly dominant position on corporate disinformation outlets. So they pretty much dominated the narrative, but the internet was upending that. It was threatening the reach. And there were actually two things that were kind of upending that monopoly. One of them was talk radio. That was becoming a big thing. And in fact, he just passed away recently. Rush Limbaugh was one of the ones that was, one of the pioneers of that. And then the other one was what they called computer bulletin boards, right, or the internet. And the Drudge Report specifically, kind of irked, Hillary Clinton because they had quashed the Monica Lewinsky story, and yet somehow the genie got out of the bottle, and it created all sorts of problems. And they couldn't control the narrative, right? And so how do you fix that? Well, what they did in 1993. The U.S. Department of Commerce created a report, and interestingly, it was done by Ron Brown. And if you remember that name, that's another discussion. He was actually instrumental in allowing China. He sold Rand Sperry stuff, or authorized the sale of Rand Sperry technology transfers to China for some very, very interesting defense tech, which gave China, a huge leg up in their competition with the U.S. And so Ron Brown, unfortunately, is not. He has an interesting past that could be looked at, especially, again, with facilitating technology transfer to China. But in this case, he authored the first 1993 report, which was saying that, yes, telecommunications does have a role in hate speech. Now, there's pages and pages of, there's like 800 numbers, phone conferences you could call into, talk radio, and then they talk about computer bulletin boards. And in that, they talk about something called Netscape, if you guys are old enough to remember that. And Netscape had allowed people to post messages in their bulletin boards that said that were anti-Semitic. So the ADL, I think Jeff Foxman was in charge at that time. I'm not sure. I have to go back and look. But anyway, ADL had said, this is anti-Semitic. How dare you? And then the Netscape altered its policy from free speech and modified it, even though it was 100 to 1. There was 100 comments that was in support of either Israel. The topic was Israel. It went into Israel's pro-Israeli and pro-Jewish, and then one or two trolls that kind of went in there and made an anti-Semitic report. And actually, it's a more of a ratio if you look at the original postings. Than you get, say, in Twitter and Facebook. There's more anti-Semitism in, Ilhan Omar's, social media presence and her followers than there was way back in Netscape. So the beginnings of that control using kind of an umbrella of hate speech, we can see that lineage from 1993. Now, what happened was this year, they updated it. So they came in there and they re-examined it. And in the original 1993 report, they were intellectually honest to some degree. They did say we cannot find a causality yet between online hate speech and actual violence, hate crimes. We haven't found causality. There's some anecdotal evidence. Some people, 9 people or 11 incidents, were reported, but we don't have it in a direct link. Well, now, 20 plus years have passed, and the new report says we have found no evidence linking electronic communication to hate crime. Right? So there's just, censoring hate speech does not make hate crimes less likely. In fact, it makes it more likely, right? It's actually counterproductive, and there is evidence of that. So in other words, if you censor people, if you make a subject taboo, you make it more enticing. And you know this, if we can bring subjects out in the open and openly debate them and people feel like their voice is heard, and then you debate them, they'll go home, sometimes they're frustrated, but they go over with it. If you forbid someone from saying something and you prohibit them from saying it, and then you constantly berate them with an idea, one of two things will happen. They either submit, or they disengage. Well, 3 things will happen. They submit, they disengage, or they engage, right? They'll actually fight against it and they become violent because you cut off their voice. And so, this could be counterproductive. I recommend everybody go in there. The link is at the bottom. Read both reports. The 1993 one's kind of interesting. It's a quick read, about 25 pages. This one's interesting, but you'll see that what a lot of social media companies are using, they're limiting speech because they call it a hate speech. Really isn't. And even if it was, it's not contributing to hate crime. So, okay, there it is. At least you can identify, okay, that schmuck is over there doing hate speech, right? You've identified him, you know your enemy, there he is, right? It's easy. And everybody remembers this last impeachment, the second impeachment. They said that Trump's speech was hate speech. And I've listened to the transcript of that thing or read the transcript a couple times, and I can't find any hate speech in there. So, we need to bring hate speech back to what it actually was, and it should be, rather than saying everything is hate speech that I don't like, therefore it's an excuse to get things banned. But just realize that, there are tools that these regulators can now use to say, look, you can't hide behind this hate speech thing as hate crime, right? If there's actually crimes being committed or there's a call to violence, yes, but you can't just blanket rubric, something as hate speech in the off chance that it might spur a hate crime, right? There you go. So next slide. Now, Texas, not to be outdone by Florida, Texas on March 1st introduced something called the Texas Senate Bill 12. And this was pretty good. This is also a good one. And it again goes back to the issue that these social media groups are supported by the U.S. government and that they are open forums, right? So it should be subject to the same protection as an open space, a public space for debate, for forums, right? Should not be restricting of free speech because they're no longer acting as a private company, right? They're editorializing, they're publishing, and a majority of people, we have 60 billion users on some of these things, are using it. So it's transformational. These are issues we have to work through. And it's good because it covers all forms of the shadow of censorship, right? So you've experienced these, and I'll read this out, and you've had these, right? Shadow bans, demonetizing, deplatforming, deboost, denial of access, right? All of those little tricks that are used, it covers them, right? So it's not just you get kicked off. It's, you don't have the same reach that somebody else does, and make that transparent, right? The best thing that some of these companies can do is release the algorithm, right? What is the algorithm it's looking at? So you can look at say if you're in a senatorial race or campaign, my opponent has this algorithm, I have this algorithm, and if it's not the same, why? And the company should justify that. We need to keep things as transparent and equal as possible. The expression covers music and memes. This is important too, because free speech is one thing, but you can nickel and dime the word speech down into, well, that meme doesn't count, that photo doesn't count, that parody song doesn't count. So realizing all of the different means of expression is important to put in that legislation. And this one does. The Texas Senate Bill 12 does it. And the good part about this, and I love this part, it has both declaratory and injunctive relief. So the users themselves can recover legal fees, right? And the state can enforce compliance to allow free expression. So if a judge determines, yep, they shouldn't have done that, that's wrong, then the state can tell the tech company, you need to be in compliance with this judge now. These people need to get back on now. You need to stop shadow banning them now. And if they don't, then there's even more penalties, and the state, the attorney general for the state, can recover the cost from the FASHTEK, whatever his costs are. So it is not a taxpayer burden. As long as they're winning cases, it's not a taxpayer burden, and the users can recover their legal fees, so they're not inhibited from claiming their rights under this proposed law to go after these guys who have deep pockets and lots of lawyers. So that's a good bill. And again, those elements should be put into that Florida bill or any national bill platform that comes up. So next slide. And this one was interesting. So I'm still looking into this. Maybe your audience can contribute to it. They may know a little bit more about it. But this is something I found out that was interesting, and I didn't know anything about it until this guy, Andrew Torba, who owns Gab, kind of gabbed about it. It's a version of tweeting. And he said, Operation Chokepoint. So he had, now it's 5 banks, I believe, shut him down in the past month. And he could not get a bank to cover him. And he's got 30 million users. And so it was kind of like, So what was Operation Chokepoint? Well, Operation Chokepoint was and this is actually on record now, that Operation Chokepoint, next slide, was the FDIC made a list up of, there was a whole bunch of what's called high risk. They defined it as high risk in quotations, businesses, and that the FDIC would not insure them. So banks, of course, were kind of, nervous about that. And so if their clients or their patrons were engaged in these businesses, which ran from not just like, things like fireworks and firearms, but payday loans, like your paycheck loans and things like that. Coin collectors, all this sort of thing. These were suddenly risky. Coal mining, believe it or not. So I mean, this was more political list of the companies that politically would donate conservatives, say. They targeted those. So suddenly they were not able to have some access to banking because banks were afraid of carrying them because they weren't going to be underwritten by the FDIC. It created such a controversy that what happened was that the Congress looked at it and they found out that, yes, it did indeed distort the law and created a situation where bankers were picking certain industries and banning them off of there. And so what are we seeing now? We're seeing people with lack of access to certain banks. They're getting kicked off of banking platforms and that sort of thing. So this is something to watch out for. Right now we're talking social media. However, we're also talking about your banking because, your apps, your online banking, PayPal, all that sort of thing, that falls under it. So your ability to be able to operate commercially or even personally to pay bills is important. And one thing I forgot to say earlier, some people say, well, so what if you're banned off of Twitter or Facebook? You can't, so what? Who cares? You're not chatting, you can go down to the coffee shop and do that. Well, the problem is a lot of emergency services, we were looking at implementing this earlier with, some of the IED alerts and things like that. Your silver alerts, your amber alerts, all of this comes through Twitter, Facebook, right? So Facebook and Twitter, some states rely on those to get the message out. Well, if you're banned from it, how are you going to get that? Tsunami warnings, earthquake warnings, volcano warnings, your FEMA alerts. Those increasingly rely on social media to disseminate quickly. So we're talking a life safety issue here. We're talking a security and safety issue by being banned from these platforms. If you voluntarily opt out, that's on you. But to be banned from it, you've now incurred a risk, and that's something that needs to be looked at as well. All right, next slide. And the final slide, basically, again, reviewing back what you can do. So most of it we talked about last week, but look at legislation in your area. If you don't have, you're in Florida, great. You've got legislators that are already moving forward. Ask DeSantis to implement some of the other ideas that are in the bills, so his bill will have teeth. If you're in Texas, you've already got the House, number 12 that you can work on. But if you're not, talk to your legislatures and, at the state level first and say, hey, we really need to discuss this. This needs to be, implemented at the state level to protect, consumer protection, right? So your privacy, your data shouldn't be sold without your consent, but also, your access to these things and, all those issues about your rights that need to be looked at because the government has effectively, without looking at it and doing an investigation, it does appear from the outside that the government has outsourced tyranny, so that it's a end run around the Constitution by subcontracting, the quelling of free speech. So get involved, talk to your congressman, get with your political groups that you have, your social groups, your church groups, your support groups, find out how you can support this and get, find your guys in your area that can get on board and move forward. So that's it. And again, hopefully that works it. Some issues will be complicated, but really when we look at it, it's a fight that needs to be fought before it's too late, if it's already not too late.
No, look, it's never too late because, look, we have to look at future generations. And I think what you pretty much laid out there, Al, from the Near East Center for Strategic Engagement perspective, where we look at the link analysis on these issues. Look, some of these things you got to look at them from your particular, not just from your particular generation, but for the future generations. If you think about it, the older generation, and to include my mom right now, my mom doesn't really use electronic means to do banking. She still fills out the check and sends it in and mails it in. So that generation, maybe this would be talking past them. The millennials that have come, they pretty much have defined themselves because they kind of were raised in this type of a social media generation. But it's a future generation, like my son, who's 8 now. What is this generation going to look like? How are we defining that future generation? And even today, people who look at defining the various generations still don't have still haven't really defined this generation, or you want to talk about, post-pandemic generation, because that post-pandemic generation is infused with this technology. They literally are part of it. is almost an artificial intelligence as part of their daily life. So when you have government steps in and says, well, we're going to restrict you from using this or that, maybe the older generations can say, nobody cares. I'll just, move on with my life, do whatever else I need to do, the way I used to do it when in the generation that I grew up. But it's very difficult for this generation that is coming up for them to be able to really break away and utilize other means, especially if we do not allow them to use other means to be successful as they move forward. And, we have to raise a generation of Americans that can be globally competitive against nations that are really controlling a lot of our platforms. Look, there's no way there's a negative or positive in each way on this issue. As we say, everybody believes that their point of view is the right point of view. But I always say that keep in mind, as we talked about today with the Ides of March, that it really does affect you. Look, what happened when Caesar was killed? The individuals that initially assassinated him, in this case Brutus and his fellows conspirators, had looked at the possibility of what would be the success in killing of Caesar. Well, their belief was that Caesar was going to take over the republic and destroy it. So in eliminating what they judged to be the threat to the people and the threat to the republic, it caused civil wars within Rome, 3 of them, and bloodshed that lasted for decades plus and defined Rome over the centuries. It also claimed their own life. The republic at the end of the day was destroyed and was replaced by what they were trying to get rid of, which in this case was the principle itself anyway, which in turn was replaced by the rule of emperors. And then the emperors endured to preserve the illusion of a republic, but no one was fooled by the fact that the republic was dead. So Brutus, in this case, and his fellow brought about the very outcome that they were seeking to forestall. In this case, the downfall of the republic and the Republican government and their institutions. And what they created was a autocratic rule for decades and destroyed Rome. And I think the individuals who are in the FASHTEK, who believe that they're doing the God's work to ensure that freedom is preserved and the republic is preserved, are actually destroying it, and eventually will end up destroying it. And who's going to end up winning in the long run? China. And the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that has Russia part of it, as they move forward with their 100-year plan as to affecting American institutions, replacing the United States as a global economic power and also the political power throughout the globe. And once we destroy this nation, because we think we're doing it for the right reasons, like Brutus did, and end up killing the republic overall and destroying its heroes, eventually what you're going to end up having is what happened to Rome. And hopefully you pretty much laid out a pretty good case, Al. I'm going to give you the last word on this Ides of March, and let's hope that the people out there who can reach across the aisle are willing to work together in order to stop what is being talked about in chatter, the possibility of real violence in the United States in the near future if this does not stop.
Well, actually, your last word was really good. This is when you distill it down, it really is the pluralistic versus the totalitarian. And how do we address this going forward as a society, with the implications being not just our domestic but our international relations and our international sovereignty. So it's pretty good, and it is something that should be across the aisles. And how we do that, how we investigate and communicate, is very important. So good job.
Thank you for saying good job, given the fact that you gave the briefing out, but we'll take it. Why not? As most bosses do.
Well, I
So
meant
we'll
I
take
meant to
a
say
look.
good job on your microphone. It's very clear. I mean, the voice is really good now. This is nice. You got a new clear picture there. This is impressive. This is very nice.
Yes, we're trying. We're trying to fight against big tech and slowly moving up. With that said, Al, it was
Good.
great to have you here. Thank you for our audience for joining us, and we'll have you back again. All in all, with that said, there's new paradigms. God bless.